Oh, hey gang. Isn't it awesome? Wow, yeah, Zach Wylde, man. No. It's fake. It's a forgery. It's a Chibson. And you guys know that I don't work on Chibsons. As a matter of principle, no. 99 times out of 100, I'll say, sorry, not interested, move along, goodbye. For a couple of reasons. Number one, I do have actual ethical concerns about the manufacture of these things, the labor practices involved, and just like the waste of materials. Like for instance, like this neck here, that's dollars to donuts. That's a piece of Canadian maple. And I know what it takes to harvest this stuff and how much it costs here. And it galls me. The other thing is people who import these things, there are only two types. There's the ones who know what they're getting. They realize that it's a laugh. It's a gamble to them. And at which point I say, like, why? Why bother? It's the other kind that you really got to worry about. And guitar repair people learn this pretty early on. It's the ones who see this, buy it, and think that by adding certain parts or upgrading certain features that they'll actually turn it into the real thing. Those are dangerous, dangerous people to work for because it's delusional. They're living in a fantasy world. And as a repair guy, you're never going to live up to that fantasy. You're never going to satisfy it. So it's like, no, hands off. Don't want to be around that kind of thinking. But in this case, you can see there's one mitigating factor, and it's the only reason I'm doing this is it's a left-handed guitar. And I feel for you lefties out there. The options are very, very minimal. Like this guy, he loves Zach Wylde, and he's not going to be able to afford a Gibson Custom Shop Lefty Zach Wylde model. He knows what he got. He realized that it's a Chibson. He's fully aware of that fact. And he wants to change certain things about it to make it a playable guitar. He realizes it's never going to be worth what he invests in it. And that, at the end of the day, it's going to play as good as it plays. He's going to have to be happy with that. Wow, that binding job. I'm not going to go through the whole guitar and point out all the inaccuracies. There are plenty of other videos on YouTube about that. You can watch those. So what are we going to do? First off, we're going to swap out this bridge. He got himself a nice Godot here, which has the correct spacing for the posts. It's a good place to start because oftentimes they really mangle these saddle slots. They'll file them very deep and very wide and irregularly. So you'll end up with some really funny buzzes that'll sound for all the world like fret buzz, but it's actually coming from the bridge. It'll drive you nuts. So we're going to get rid of that. He wants to change out these pickups, these theoretical EMGs, which aren't. They're bad. Like, I'm not even going to do a before for you guys on this one. Just imagine really bad pickups. Let's not waste our time. They're very thin, like the output is very low. I bet you they've got like 6 turns of wire on each bobbin. He found these. These are Dragonfires. I've never worked with them before. They're a budget brand, but they've got relatively good reviews, so we'll see what they do. And electronically, he wants to swap it all out. He wants to go with USA-made parts. We're going to go with CTS pots and good caps. He wants a Switchcraft jack. So at least the electronics will be reliable. These pots, it's funny. Like, they're loose in some areas and tight in others. It's hard to describe. And, you probably shouldn't be able to get to 10 and keep going. Yeah. Just keep going. Whoa. Yeah, okay. That shouldn't be. I think I'm spinning the wires around into a little nest inside there. So we're going to have to get rid of all those. Will there be some fret dressing involved? Oh, I can almost guarantee it. And the nut, of course, will probably need some work as well. We're lucky in that the basic geometry of this guitar is okay. Sometimes the neck pitch is really off. You can get a bridge that's super, super high just at the end of the adjustment mechanism. Sometimes they're too low, and you can't adjust the action to where it needs to be without running into the pickup covers. This one's okay. We'll make it work. And I just noticed this. It's the ultimate in dignity. They actually put the pickup selector ring on upside down, figuring, I suppose, that left-handers see the world from a completely different viewpoint. What if it's actually wired that way? Would that be easier? Probably not. Looking inside here, we've got some CF mini pots, strips of masking tape, seemingly at random, and what could have been shielding paint I think is actually like a black felt tip marker. And it's a good thing this thing's carrying guitar level voltages, because anything higher, it would probably be on fire. I'm not going to try to save any of this, obviously. I'm just going to clip it all out. Okay, I might reuse the ground wire for the bridge. Rather than try and drill these things out for the larger shaft diameter, I tend to use a tapered reamer. It's less tendency to crack the lacquer than a drill. You can see that this one here has got a big chunk out of it from the factory. Oops. These fit fine except for this one here, which was drilled too close to the edge of the cavity. I'm going to have to get creative and gouge some of this wall away so that it'll sit flat in there.
I had some conductive shielding paint out for another job, so I decided to go ahead and give it a coat. Couldn't hurt.
Okay, the paint's dry. It's time to do some wiring. I've got a diagram here. I really do like the Seymour Duncan website for this, mostly because they're very reliable. You can put in the combination of hardware you have and they'll give you various options. Especially when you're just getting into guitar electronics, you'll often find yourself on really weird forums from like the early 2000s looking at very sketchy diagrams drawn up by someone's brother. And it should work for you, man, but oftentimes it doesn't. Seymour won't steer you wrong. You know it's going to function at least. Saying that, I know that this is not actually a classical Les Paul design. I can tell that by the situation of the tone pot here. They've got it running from the middle lug and grounding off the back of the pot. Usually in Les Pauls, you'll see the tone will actually, the cap will run between the volume and the tone in various lugs, depending on which era it was made. And, I mean, there's all kinds of subtleties for setting this up, and they all have very small differences in the way they affect each other. Usually it's in the relationship between the volume and the tone pot. Like the 50s design, for instance, will give you a bit more brightness, especially if you're playing at lower volumes. It maintains sort of the brightness situation, doesn't get darker as you turn down the volume, which is useful in certain situations, especially if you're playing clean. It's a kind of subtlety that really gets lost if you're playing with high output pickups and a lot of gain, and you've maxed out your volume all the time. I mean, it doesn't make any difference really at that point. But if you're a jazz guy, that's the kind of thing that they like to play with. Just very, very subtle variations in tone. But I think this will work for us. I think that's a good start. And I was looking at these pickups here. They seem to be much nicer than the ones that came out of the guitar. Actually, these ones here, the ones that came out, I don't think there's any metal in these. I think these are completely plastic, and they're incredibly light. They weigh like an ounce. So they've given me a diagram, handy dandy, on the back of the box here, which shows me north and south and the combination of wiring, which is the output, etc. The stupid thing is, of course, okay, I won't say stupid, but the confounding thing is that they've reversed the typical Seymour Duncan wiring. So their output in this case is the green wire, which, you know, why? Okay, I'll figure it out, but you got to double check yourself, because if you're using a diagram like this, everything's going to be backwards if you follow the colors. So it kind of negates the idea. Why would you have the different colors? So let's get this thing wired up.
Now, it makes sense to do as much of the wiring off the guitar as possible. It's just more convenient and safer, so I'm making myself a little template here of the layout.
You can see I made myself up a little cardboard holder here. And I've also made notations just so I can remind myself that I'm working on a left-handed guitar, and it just sort of keeps me honest. I really don't want to get through this and find out that I've done things backwards. So I'm just going to cut out some pieces here that will be necessary for bridging various components.
Just lightly sanding the back of the pots here to get rid of the oxides. I'm not sure if this is strictly necessary. I think a lot of factories forego this step, but my friends all do this, so I do too.
Now, I don't claim to be an electronics wizard, but I do know that you have to keep your iron tinned and tin all your leads and use the correct kind of solder. Well, here's the point in the conversation where there'll be some debate in the comments between people who want to call it solder and those who insist it must be called solder. Well, frankly, Nigel, this is why no one wants to sit next to you at the party. No, there are about 400 million of us calling it solder, and we're doing just fine, thanks. It's time to put the pickup rings on the pickups here. Here's my little 10-cent trick for helping this job. You know, you can buy a device designed for this. Cost you quite a bit of money, relatively speaking. I just use a alligator clip on the shaft here. That'll hold the spring down, and then you can get the thread started, and there's no fuss or no muss. Save some cursing.
You know, working inside the cavity is always much more difficult, and your hand usually gets in the way of the camera, too. This is not boutique wiring by any means, but it's sound and it functions. We'll put some copper foil on the back of the pickup cover to complete the shielding. So here's my trick for making an Asian import knob fit onto the larger knurling size of a CTS pot. I keep an old one around for this. I don't use the new ones on the guitar, obviously. But I warm it up with a soldering iron there, get it good and warm, and then I jam the knob on. The plastic will melt and soften enough to conform to the larger knurling size.
Okay, with the wiring done, we can get into some other fun stuff. There's a couple of inlays here that have popped up. So we'll glue those back down again. Just going to wax off around them a little bit. I'll hold that down firmly in place. And we'll get a little bit of glue, thin super glue, right along the edge here. That'll make its way down inside. Single edge razor blade, 2 pieces of tape, one on either side. Make a little scraper here. Much better. Okay, fretwork. I should mention that before I did anything on this guitar, I checked to make sure it actually had a truss rod and that it functioned. And here I'm using this notch straight edge to see what the surface of the fingerboard is like, because I know that the top surface of these frets is not likely to be true. So I've managed to adjust it as good as it can be. I'm trying to make it perfectly straight. That's impossible. This board either was never leveled perfectly flat in the factory, or it's warped since it left. There's a bit of a bump here around the 3rd, 4th frets, and then there's a bit of a dip in frets 7, 8, 9, 10. So it's a bit of a roller coaster. If this was a very expensive guitar, we would be pulling all the frets and I would be leveling the fingerboard and making it right. But this guitar does not warrant that. And the frets here, they seem to be quite tall. Let's take a measurement and see. Yeah, they're about 52 thousandths of an inch. So these are probably completely undressed, like Dunlop 6100s or something like that, a jumbo fret. So I should be able to dress these down relatively flat and get us somewhere near playable. Just looking here, I can see especially the 1st fret. Well, I'll get you up close and you can maybe see it yourself. I don't know if you can see it, but the end of this fret here on what was formerly the treble side, now the bass side, is up, it's raised. I can fit a feeler gauge that's 4 thousandths of an inch under it. So you've got to take care of that before you go too far. And I think the second one is probably the same. Here's my squeezable handheld fret press. And I'm using a caul in here that is of a tighter radius than the fingerboard. This is a 12-inch board. I think the radius in here is a 9.5. So what that's doing is it's putting pressure on the outside edges of the fret here, the part that's loose. Just going to squeeze that and see if that will stay. No, it comes right back up again. So I'm going to have to get some thin super glue under there.
This is not a high-tech leveling arrangement. This is just my old level here with some sandpaper stuck to the bottom of it. This is good for probably 90% of the jobs I do. I do actually have a homemade neck jig which I'll drag out for really tricky necks, but this one's fine. We'll get rid of the very sharp fret ends. Here I'm re-establishing the crown on those frets. Had to take a lot of material off some of them. here I'm polishing up to a fine finish with micro mesh. The nut had obviously been converted from a standard right-hand one, so the high E-string was in a funny location, and it was also flopping around in a very wide slot, so I filled it with some bone dust and super glue and recut it in a better place. I also dressed off a lot of the excess height.
Okay, I set up the saddles here for intonation. You guys have seen me do that recently, and I did the saddle slots using my nut files here. The slots don't have to be deep, just a little nick, just enough to keep the strings from sliding around on there. And then did the pickup height. It's ready to go. So in the final estimation, does it make sense to buy one of these things and expect to be able to make it play? And yes, I have made it play. The action's around a 1/16 of an inch, about 1.4 millimeters. And this is set up in drop D standard tuning. He wants to go low with this. I gotta say no on this one, guys, because there's so much wrong with these. I can tell this one was never tested at the factory. Like, for instance, the leads to the switch up here were shorted so that you could only ever get like both pickups on at once. You couldn't switch to bridge or neck. You had to have both of them on at the same time. Didn't matter what you did. Some of the things you'd have to do could be within the capabilities of a hobbyist, but some of the others, like unless you have experience and technical knowledge and a kit full of specialized tools, you'd never get it to work right. At which point you're gonna have to find someone like me to do the work for you. That gets expensive. Like, so much is wrong that you can't predict with it. Like, you have to fix one thing in order to reveal the next thing in the chain that's malfunctioning, and that goes on and on and on. There's something else I should talk about. I don't understand how anyone can buy a guitar without playing it first. That makes no sense to me. Unless you're a collector who never intends to use it, you're just going to put it in the case. Got to get the thing in your hands and find out what it does before you hand over your money. Especially to people like these who aren't ever going to give you a refund if something goes wrong. So I will try to make some sounds with this. It's a lefty again, so I'll be upside down and backwards. Hopefully you can hear what the pickups sound like. Thanks for watching, guys.